This is Wednesday. Database and SQL. They spent quite a bit of time on practice too. We reviewed data models, talked about developing information systems, and then started talking about some specifics about data. This is week 3, and this is day 5 of the class. Data models. So what we start off with, the students discussed with each other the conceptual model, logical and physical data models. Yeah, referring to data models. We're modeling the data. That's a little hard to perceive at first. Look at some specifics. Here we talked about you have a browser or the command line, and then you communicate with the physical data. We do SQL, the physical data. Data is actually stored somewhere on a hard drive. And we have a browser in which we can enter specifics and communicate. Let's keep moving. We'll talk more about this whole idea. But it might be helpful to look at the conceptual view as the overall view, and then you have where you look at the data from top down. This is where the users would see. We draw out how the data is going to look, and then we draw out the specifics about the data in the table. There's definitely some difference here. Here we talked this view, and then here where the data is actually stored. We use a database management system, and I refer to it as an engine, to actually write and retrieve data on the hard drive. Now, this whole area in here is what we study. You know, how do we organize the data? How do we see it logically in order for this to function? So let's look at some terms. When we think about databases, one of the first keys is to understand what the entities are, very often referred to as tables. What specific items do we want to gather information about? So you start out with an entity or a table, and you talk about the characteristics of that entity, often referred to as attributes, or in a lot of databases they refer to them as fields. Then we organize those and we create tuples or records. And looking at the entity, then you build what is referred to as relationships between the identities. So you have a table, a table, a table, and those tables relate to each other, maybe in one way or another. Okay, let's move on to the next page. We're going to use some examples here in a little bit, but first of all, we're going to take our first shot at top-down design. This isn't anything that's a whole lot different than a number of things we talked about before. First thing we have to do is we analyze, okay? We used a red box over here, example. You know, how do they keep track of data? Well, we said they keep track of movies, their customers, and what's rented. So these would be 3 different entities. And when we talk about entities, we have the attributes, the things that define the entity. So we had some ID for the movie, the genre, the name, the length, maybe the date. We didn't list everything. But you notice all of these things describe a movie. Okay? In here we don't put who rented the movie because that doesn't describe the movie. Then we talked about customers, customer ID and name, these things, their phone number, their email, these things all identify the customer. Then down here we have a more fluid, or a table that isn't not as persistent. These tables are persistent. When we put records in here, typically they don't change a lot, like every day. You know, you can have records in there that don't change for a week or a month. Down here, then, here's what we have. We can take a primary key from one table and put it into another table. This would be then a foreign key. Primary key, foreign key. So this is the movie, and this is who's renting it, and maybe the date. And then we can give that a number. So then we can fill this table with records. You know, shoots, maybe I rented 2 movies there. So tying these together, primary keys to foreign keys, that builds relationships. And then each table here is an entity. How do we come up with these designs? Well, like I started talking about here, it starts out with analysis. We have figured out what data we want to collect and how we're going to analyze that data and what we want out of it. Nowadays, it's an interesting kind of a problem, actually a little bit, where we collect huge amounts of data and not really sure how we're going to analyze it yet. But we do. Okay? Anyway, once we understand our data, then we can start to design, and that would be designing entities and deciding what general attributes would be tied to the entities. Developing is you put specifics in your tables and start developing them. You start creating them. And then implementation, you put it to work. Okay, you start using the database, and then you evaluate if it's working. If you find some issues, you go up and you analyze the issues, design a solution, develop the solution, and implement it. Sometimes this would be referred to as a life cycle. You can keep fixing and fixing until eventually you start with a whole new design. Important parts. We're going to talk a lot about keys, talk about key attributes, and what constraints we might have on those attributes. So then, let me reiterate. Here was our example. We create entities. Each attribute is specific to that entity. We have primary keys, and then we can take primary keys and put them in another table, and they become foreign keys. Whoops. This one here and that one there. And they become foreign keys. Then we talked about when you look at a table, is there an area where you can take something out of the table and create another table? So this was, we had talked about here, this address, we were talking about city, state, zip. Well, city, state, and zip, if these are movies being rented, let's say in Mason City area, there would be a lot of Mason City, Iowa 50401. And rather than do that, we take that out and maybe call it location. Then we'd put an LID field in here. And then maybe this is the number for Mason City. Now we just put this number in instead of all this information. It's it's referred to as normalizing the table. So then we can store this information over here. Some places actually just store the zip, and then they use the zip to look up the city. A lot of information, but the more and more we go over it, the easier it'll be to understand. That's it.